Okay, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, and we are continuing from the last time we left it on Tales and Allegories of Religion in section 24. So we'll just continue on from there. Last time, the first half of the section is actually very interesting stuff about truth and true concepts, something which is generally unheard of. So, the Tales and Allegories of Religion. This lapse from natural unity has not escaped notice, and nations from the earliest times have asked the meaning of the wonderful division of the spirit against itself. No such inward disunion is found in nature. Natural things do nothing wicked. The Mosaic legend of the fall of man, I assume Mosaic here is referring to Moses, for those who don't know. The Mosaic legend of the fall of man has preserved an ancient picture representing the origin and consequence of this disunion. The incidents of the legend form the basis of an essential article of the creed, the doctrine of original sin in man and his consequent need of succor. It may be well at the commencement of logic to examine the story which treats of the origin and the bearings of the very knowledge which logic has to discuss. For, though philosophy must not allow herself to be overawed by religion or accept a position of existence on sufferance, she cannot afford the neglect of these popular conceptions. The tales and allegories of religion, which have enjoyed for thousands of years the veneration of nations, are not to be set aside as antiquated even now. Upon a closer inspection of the story of the fall, we find, as we already said, that it exemplifies the universal bearings of knowledge upon the spiritual life. In its instinctive and natural stage, spiritual life wears the garb of innocence and confiding simplicity. But the very essence of spirit implies the absorption of this immediate condition in something higher. The spiritual is distinguished from the natural, and more especially from the animal life, in the circumstances that it does not continue a mere stream of tendency, but sunders itself to self-realization. But this position of severed life has in its turn to be suppressed, and the spirit has by its own act to win its way to concord again. The final concord, then, is spiritual. That is, the principle of restoration is found in thought, and thought only. The hand that inflicts the wound is also the hand which heals it. So that's talking about the story of the fall in Genesis. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's very short, and generally very useful to know for Western culture. So let's see, at the fall we've already defined, as was already said, that it exemplifies the universal bearings of knowledge upon the spiritual life. In its instinct natural stage, spiritual life wears the garb of innocence and confiding simplicity. Logically speaking, things have to start out ignorant, and in the story of the fall, we were ignorant and we were innocent before the fall. But the very essence of spirit implies the absorption of this immediate condition in something higher, so mediation. The spiritual is distinguished from the natural, and more especially from the animal life, in the circumstance that it does not continue a mere stream of tendency, but sunders itself to self-realization. So in this case, self-consciousness as knowledge distinguishes itself from the immediacy of its own life as an animal. We start to distinguish ourselves from our body. That's where the whole thing of shame comes from in the fall, in Hegel's interpretation, where they realize they're naked and they ask God to give them some clothes. And this is part of the sundering of consciousness from itself. But this position of severed life has in its turn to be suppressed, and the spirit has by its own act to win its way to concord again. So we have that division between spirit and nature, but then this division is undone by spirit in spirit. We are told in our story that Adam and Eve, the first human beings, the types of humanity, were placed in a garden, where grew a tree of life and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God, it is said, had forbidden them to eat of the fruit of this latter tree. Of the tree of life, for the present, nothing further is said. These words evidently assume that man is not intended to seek knowledge, and ought to remain in this state of innocence. Other meditative races, it may be remarked, have held the same belief that the primitive state of mankind was one of innocence and harmony. Now, all this is to a certain extent correct. The disunion that appears throughout humanity is not a condition to rest in, but it is a mistake to regard the natural and immediate harmony as the right state. The mind is not mere instinct. On the contrary, it essentially involves the tendency to reasoning and meditation. Childlike innocence, no doubt, has in it something fascinating and attractive, but only because it reminds us of what the spirit must win for itself. The harmoniousness of childhood is a gift from the hand of nature. The second harmony must spring from the labor and culture of the spirit. And so the words of Christ, quote, "Except ye become as little children," end quote, etc., are very far from telling us that we must always remain children. That phrase can be interpreted in many ways. The laity tends to interpret that in the sense of you should just believe things, innocently, just like children do. Children just believe in Santa. They don't question things. They just obey their parents. And, people take it, we ought to be like children in that way. But no, that's not how that fully makes sense, really. The childlikeness that one can speculatively consider here is the spontaneity of freedom in children, where children play a lot. And after a certain point of self-mastery, after, training in anything, really, one becomes playful through sheer mastery. And this is a different kind of playfulness than the immediate playfulness of children, but it is nonetheless a playfulness. Again, we find in the narrative of Moses that the occasion which led man to leave his natural unity is attributed to solicitation from without. The serpent was the tempter. But the truth is that the step into opposition, the awakening of consciousness, follows from the very nature of man, and the same history repeats itself in every son of Adam. The serpent represents likeness to God as consisting in the knowledge of good and evil, and it is just this knowledge in which man participates when he breaks with the unity of his instinctive being and eats of the forbidden fruit. The first reflection of awakened consciousness in men told them that they were naked. This is a naive and profound trait. For the sense of shame bears evidence to the separation of man from his natural and sensuous life. The beasts never get so far as this separation, and they feel no shame. And it is in the human feeling of shame that we are to seek the spiritual and moral origin of dress, compared with which the merely physical need is a secondary matter. Pretty self-explanatory. Next comes the curse, as it is called, which God pronounced upon man. The prominent point in that curse turns chiefly on the contrast between man and nature. Man must work in the sweat of his brow, and woman bring forth in sorrow. As to work, if it is the result of the disunion, it is also the victory over it. The beasts have nothing more to do but to pick up the materials required to satisfy their wants. Man, on the contrary, can only satisfy his wants by himself producing and transforming the necessary means. Thus, even in these outside things, man is dealing with himself. The story does not close with the expulsion from paradise. We are further told, God said, quote, "Behold, Adam is become as one of us, to know good and evil." End quote. Knowledge is now spoken of as divine, and not, as before, as something wrong and forbidden. Such words contain a confutation of the idle talk that philosophy pertains only to the finitude of the mind. Philosophy is knowledge, and it is through knowledge that man first realizes his original vocation, to be the image of God. When the record adds that God drove them out of the Garden of Eden to prevent their eating of the tree of life, it only means that on his natural side, certainly man is finite and mortal, but in knowledge, infinite. We all know the theological dogma that man's nature is evil, tainted with what is called original sin. Now, while we accept the dogma, we must give up the setting of incident, which represents original sin as consequent upon an accidental act of the first man. For the very notion of spirit is enough to show that man is evil by nature, and it is an error to imagine that he could ever be otherwise. To such extent as man is and acts like a creature of nature, his whole behavior is what it ought not to be. For the spirit it is a duty to be free, and to realize itself by its own act. Nature is for man only the starting point which he has to transform. The theological doctrine of original sin is a profound truth, but modern enlightenment prefers to believe that man is naturally good, and that he acts right so long as he continues true to nature. So, this is Hegel creatively reinterpreting that. Because when people say man is evil by nature, what they mean is that the essence of man, humanity as humanity, is evil. And here Hegel's like playing with words, and he says, yes, man is evil by nature. And what he means is the natural side of man is evil. But the spiritual side is the one that is good. But obviously we are embodied beings. We have a significant interplay with that natural part of ourselves. And so it is a struggle. But it is a struggle that can be won. So, the natural side of man is evil, but the actual nature of humanity, the rational side, the spiritual side, is absolutely good. The hour when man leaves the path of mere natural being marks the difference between him, a self-conscious agent, and the natural world. But this schism, though it forms a necessary element in the very notion of spirit, is not the final goal of man. It is to this state of inward breach that the whole finite action of thought and will belongs. In that finite sphere, man pursues ends of his own and draws from himself the material of his conduct. While he pursues these aims to the utmost, while his knowledge and his will seek himself, his own narrow self, apart from the universal, he is evil, and his evil is to be subjective. Let's see. So, although nature is evil, we must separate ourselves from nature. He says the schism is necessary, but it's not the final goal of man. And it is to the state of inward breach that the whole finite action and thought and will belongs. In that sphere, man pursues ends of his own and draws from himself the material of his conduct. While he pursues these aims to the uttermost, while his knowledge and his will seek himself, his own narrow self apart from the universal, he is evil. So if you start, we start with our immediate desires, natural impulses, and whatnot, and we just follow those without meeting those through true thought or true concepts. All we're doing is trying to actually universalize particularity, which is evil. It's like the organs in your body fighting amongst each other about which one gets to rule. Call the shots, as opposed to realizing that they're parts of the universal body and that their own being needs the condition of the whole for them to even exist. Evil destroys itself precisely because in seeking only its particularity, it undoes the very condition which is its condition of existence. We seem at first to have a double evil here, but both are really the same. Man, insofar as he is spirit, is not the creature of nature, and when he behaves as such and follows the cravings of appetite, he wills to be so. The natural wickedness of man is therefore unlike the natural life of animals. A mere natural life may be more exactly defined by saying that the natural man as such is an individual, for nature in every part is in the bonds of individualism. Thus, when man wills to be a creature of nature, he wills in the same degree to be an individual simply. Yet against such impulsive and appetitive action, due to the individualism of nature, there also steps in the law or general. There are also steps in the law or general principle. This law may either be an external force or have the form of divine authority. So long as he continues in his natural state, man is in bondage to the law. It is true that among the instincts and affections of man, there are social or benevolent inclinations, love, sympathy, and others, reaching beyond his selfish isolation. But so long as these tendencies are instinctive, their virtual universality of scope and purport is vitiated by the subjective form which always allows free play to self-seeking and random action. In the individual here, this is always an odd thing. I think like in German there's just different words for this, which they really aren't in English. In which there's like the concrete individual and there's the abstract individual. What he's talking about here is the abstract individual, like the atom, the pretense that something is independently existing on its own, which nothing does except for the absolute. Alright, that finishes that section. The concrete formations of consciousness. The term objective thoughts indicates the truth which is to be the absolute object of philosophy and not merely the goal at which it aims. But the very expression cannot fail to suggest an opposition, to characterize and appreciate which is the main motive of the philosophical attitude of the present time, and which forms the real problem of the question about truth and our means of ascertaining it. If the thought forms are vitiated by a fixed antithesis, that is, if they are only of a finite character, they are unsuitable for the self-centered universe of truth, and truth can find no adequate receptacle in thought. Such thought, which can produce only limited and partial categories and proceed by their means, is what in the stricter sense of the word is termed understanding. The finitude, further, of these categories lies in 2 points. Firstly, they are only subjective, and the antithesis of an objective permanently clings to them. Secondly, they are always of restricted content, and so persist in antithesis to one another and still more to the absolute. In order more fully to explain the position and import here attributed to logic, the attitudes in which thought is supposed to stand to objectivity will next be examined by way of further introduction. So let me read that real quick. So let's see, the term objective thoughts indicates the truth which is to be the absolute object of philosophy and not merely the goal at which it aims. So, it's basically saying truth is not simply what we're hoping, we might get in the future. Truth has to be there from the beginning. Philosophy is called the love of wisdom, and Hegel says philosophy must stop just seeking wisdom. It must actually gain knowledge. It must become science. And okay, seems like all right, look, am I back?
Yes.
All right. So, continuing, but the very expression cannot fail to suggest an opposition, that is, objectivity as opposed to subjectivity, to characterize and appreciate which is the main motive of the philosophical attitude of the present time, and which forms the real problem of the question about truth and our means of ascertaining it. By objective truth, we mean the whole truth, but the reality is that the whole truth is actually not merely objective. If the thought forms are vitiated by a fixed antithesis, that is, if they are only of a finite character, they are unsuitable for the self-centered universe of truth, and truth can find no adequate receptacle in thought. If I assume that's just like in the case that if you take it, truth is the world of facts, the world out there. And so, sure, we understand there is a truth, but somehow we as thinkers and our own representations and things are outside of truth, which is the Kantian problem. It's the problem of all transcendental philosophy, which is really the essential problem of all epistemology. So such thought, which can produce only limited and partial categories and proceed by their means, is what in the stricter sense of the word is termed understanding. So understanding refers to a finite form of thinking, a finite cognition, which cannot overcome the opposition between objectivity and subjectivity. The finitude further these categories lies in 2 points. Firstly, they are only subjective, and the antithesis of an objective permanently clings to them. Secondly, they are always of restricted content, and so persist in antithesis to one another and still more to the absolute. So they are restricted content, meaning like you just have one concept here, one concept there. They don't connect to each other. Some of them might actually even oppose each other. And it's noticed by everybody that obviously neither or none of the concepts of that kind is absolute. So they oppose each other, but they also oppose the very idea of absoluteness. In my phenomenology of the spirit, I prefer phenomenology of spirit, which on that account was at its publication described as the first part of the system of philosophy, the method adopted was to begin with the first and simplest phase of mind, immediate consciousness, and to show how that stage gradually of necessity worked onward to the philosophical point of view, the necessity of that view being proved by the process. But in these circumstances it was impossible to restrict the quest to the mere form of consciousness. For the stage of philosophical knowledge is the richest in material and organization, and therefore, as it came before us in the shape of a result, it presupposed the existence of the concrete formations of consciousness, such as individual and social morality, art, and religion. In the development of consciousness, which at first sight appears limited to the point of form merely, there is thus at the same time included the development of the matter of the objects discussed in the special branches of philosophy. But the latter process must, so to speak, go on behind consciousness, since those facts are the essential nucleus which is raised into consciousness. The exposition accordingly is rendered more intricate, because so much that properly belongs to the concrete branches is prematurely dragged into the introduction. The survey which follows in the present work has even more the inconvenience of being only historical and inferential in its method, but it tries especially to show how the questions men have proposed outside the school on the nature of knowledge, faith, and the like, questions which they imagine have no connection with abstract thoughts, are really reducible to the simple categories which first get cleared up in logic. All right, well, we've made it past the first section of the introduction. Oh, well, the second, we skipped the first section. Let's see, how long have we gone? It's 24 minutes. Yeah, we got plenty of time. So 3. First attitude of thought to objectivity. This is actually what I wanted to read. That's what I was interested in. And notice that Hegel's actually going to make regular arguments, so they should be more comprehensible to the immediate ways we understand, at least nowadays, than his usual stuff. And he actually apologizes that he doesn't do it in his usual manner, because it's better. And these are to give some kind of explanation. They're a bit rhetorical. They are arguments, true arguments, I think, but they are not properly arguments of the philosophical kind, as Hegel considers them. Section 26. The first of these attitudes of thought is seen in the method which has no doubts and no sense of the contradiction in thought or of the hostility of thought against itself. It entertains an unquestioning belief that reflection is the means of ascertaining the truth and of bringing the objects before the mind as they really are. And in this belief it advances straight upon its objects, takes the materials furnished by sense and perception, and reproduces them from itself as facts of thought. And then, believing this result to be the truth, the method is content. Philosophy in its earliest stages, all the sciences, and even the daily action and movement of consciousness live in this faith. This method of thought has never become aware of the antithesis of subjective and objective, and to that extent there is nothing to prevent its statements from possessing a genuinely philosophical and speculative character, though it is just as possible that they may never get beyond finite categories, or the stage where the antithesis is still unresolved. In the present introduction, the main question for us is to observe this attitude of thought in its extreme form, and we shall accordingly first of all examine its second and inferior aspect as a philosophic system. One of the clearest instances of it, and one lying nearest to ourselves, may be found in the metaphysics of the past as it subsisted among us previously to the philosophy of Kant. It is, however, only in reference to the history of philosophy that this metaphysic can be said to belong to the past. The thing is always and at all places to be found as the view which the abstract understanding takes of the objects of reason, and it is in this point that the real and immediate good lies in a closer examination in its main scope and its modus operandi. Section 28. This metaphysical system took the laws and forms of thought to be the fundamental laws and forms of things. It assumed that to think a thing was the means of finding its very self and nature, and to that extent it occupied higher ground than the critical philosophy which succeeded it. But in the first instance, these terms of thought were cut off from their connection, their solidarity. Each was believed valid by itself and capable of serving as a predicate of the truth. It was the general assumption of this metaphysic that a knowledge of the absolute was gained by assigning predicates to it. It neither inquired what the terms of the understanding especially meant or what they were worth, nor did it test the method which characterizes the absolute by assigning of predicates. As an example of such predicates may be taken existence in the proposition God has an existence. Finitude or infinity, as in the question, is the world finite or infinite? Simple and complex, in the proposition, the soul is simple, or again, the thing is a unity, a whole, etc. Nobody asks whether such predicates had any intrinsic and independent truth, or if the propositional form could be a form of truth. Important there, nobody asked if the propositional form could even be a form of truth. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, by propositions they just mean sentences. Hegel does not take sentences to be the element of thought. Sentences are not the unit of thought. What is the unit of thought is a concept. Prior to the arising of propositional logic, which I think first arose with the Greek Stoics, and was far more worked out by the Roman Stoics. Something closer to consciousness was considered to be the element of thought. It was called term logic as opposed to propositional logic. So, what Hegel says, nobody asked whether such predicates had any intrinsic and independent truth. Nobody asked if any of these things were ever actually things at all, which would also count as a category or concept. Not only do you have to ask, well, is existence even a thing? can you predicate things in the first place? Like, what is the actual relationship of predication to substances or subjects which are predicated? Because one just assumes that you can just append predicates to subjects or substances willy-nilly. It's just like putting a definition, X, Y, and Z, and you've put them together in a sentence, yes, but what does that have to do with truth? What does that have to do with that thing actually being in itself what you say it is? The metaphysic of the past assumed, as a sophisticated belief always does, that thought apprehends the very self of things, and that things, to become what they truly are, require to be thought. For nature and the human soul are a very Proteus in their perpetual transformations, and it soon occurs to the observer that the first crude impression of things is not their essential being. This is a point of view the very reverse of the result arrived at by the critical philosophy, a result of which may be said that it bade man go and feed on mere husks and chaff. Again, for those who aren't aware, the critical philosophy is Immanuel Kant's philosophy, which was a great revolution in philosophy, and Kant is a great thinker in his own right. But Hegel clearly dislikes Kant and thinks that Kant was a revelation insofar as Kant revealed like how bad philosophy had gotten, and then went on to make a step that made it worse. It's interesting. I don't know who. Well, I have actually seen this. Not in the West, because it's been quite a while since I read any of the ancient philosophy. I used to have a Copplestone's book on it. Probably still do somewhere. Which is pretty good, by the way, if you want to read a history of Western philosophy. Collected Copplestone's books on the history of philosophy are actually pretty good. But I don't remember reading anybody who says that, that to become what they truly are, things require to be thought. I've seen this actually in Chinese philosophy with Dao Shui, Neo-Confucianism, where there is indeed a thought that the human being as a thinking being is the one who brings the way, the nature of things to completion. It's like nature can do its own thing. It's not that it needs us for the most part or often, but there are times where nature kind of screws up and we are kind of there to cognize and say, oh, something's wrong, but I know the actual nature of this thing, so I can, bring it to completion. There's also a sense of that some people have about how this is not just merely Hegelians. This is kind of a really out there sci-fi / spiritual belief that some people have about humanity being the kind of being which will pull the rest of reality up to its own level. So, there's actually a sci-fi book series called Uplifting or something. I forget. I remember that concept's particularly there, in which it's in the far future we gain knowledge of genetic modification and manage to make animals more intelligent, and so we humanize them, we bring them into the human domain, and so we have things like having dolphins do jobs along with us, being ship navigators, and monkeys, becoming intelligent, working as scientists and all these other things. That's the thing that comes to mind when I read this, that for things to become what they truly are, in the Hegelian sense would be free, they require to be thought. And not only thought by us, but then to be thought by themselves. So continuing. Oh, and just a comment on the critical philosophy thing. that critical philosophy bade man to go and feed on mere husks and chaff, because at least prior to Kant, dogmatic metaphysics, or dogmatic philosophy as he called it, at least believed that we had a connection to the world and that there was access to truth. And Kant comes in and says, not really. We can only know appearances. We can't know things in itself. We can't know God. We can't know anything transcendental. And but don't worry, that's philosophy now. And Hegel says, that's basically telling us to go feed on husks and chaff instead of actually eating real food. So even though the critical turn was necessary, it was a mistake to take it so seriously, which a lot of people did and still do. It's actually quite a dominant trend, even though most people don't even have an idea that there's a guy named Kant and that there is such a thing as a critical philosophy. But they believe things in this way. All these people about, it's all just languages. We don't actually, we can't really, know things as such. Very Kantian thing. It's very common. Especially among pseudo-intellectuals. But it's also very common in academia, apparently. So we must look more closely into the procedure of that old metaphysic. In the first place, it never went beyond the province of the analytic understanding. Without preliminary inquiry, it adopted the abstract categories of thought and let them rank as predicates of truth. But in using the term thought, we must not forget the difference between finite or discursive thinking and the thinking which is infinite and rational. The categories, as they meet us prima facie and in isolation, are finite forms. So it's a little bit of critique of Kant's. But truth is always infinite and cannot be expressed or presented to consciousness in finite terms. The phrase infinite thought may excite surprise if we adhere to the modern conception that thought is always limited. But it is speaking rightly, the very essence of thought to be infinite. The nominal explanation of calling a thing finite is that it has an end, that it exists up to a certain point only, where it comes into contact with and is limited by its other. The finite thereof subsists in reference to its other, which is its negation and presents itself as its limit. Now thought is always in its own sphere, its relations are within its... Now thought is always in its own sphere, its relations are with itself, and it is its own object. In having a thought for object, I am at home with myself. The thinking power, the I, is therefore infinite, because when it thinks, it is in relation to an object which is itself. Generally speaking, an object means a something else, a negative confronting me. But in this case, where thought thinks itself, it has an object which is at the same time no object. In other words, its objectivity is suppressed and transformed into an idea. Thought, as thought, therefore, in its unmixed nature, involves no limits. It is finite only when it keeps to limited categories, which it believes to be ultimate. Infinite or speculative thought, on the contrary, while it no less defines, does in the very act of limiting and defining make that defect vanish. And so infinity is not, as most frequently happens, to be conceived as an abstract away and away forever and ever, but in the simple manner previously indicated. So, infinity for Hegel is qualitative. It's not quantitative, so shouldn't mistake when something's called infinite that it's some kind of infinite extension or something. It's just unbound. It has no end, it has no beginning, qualitatively. Let's see, he mentions here earlier, but in using the term thought, we must not forget the difference between finite or discursive thinking and the thinking which is infinite and rational. Discursive thought is a Kantian term. If I remember, correctly, it has to do with the faculties and categories interplaying with each other to create a judgment, which is a unit of thought for Kant. But don't take my word for that. Look it up. But it is a Kantian term. Hegel himself doesn't really use it for describing anything he does. Let's see. So the finite therefore is a persistent reference to its other, which is its negation, and presents itself as its limit. So the finite is always a reference to an other. Thought is always in its own sphere. Its relations are with itself, and it is its own object. In having a thought for object, I am at home with myself. So, when I think anything, and I have an object, no matter how poor my own cognition of that object is, the object of my cognition is nothing but my thought of that object. This is actually revealed pretty strongly in the Phenomenology Spirit. That whole book is nothing but a series of revelations of how everything we think that is just some obvious given thing is nothing but the projection of what we think a thing even is in the first place. So we never really have an object of cognition that is not a thought itself. Therefore, if finitude is being in relationship to an other, well, if thought is relationship to thought, then it's not relationship to something other than thought. Therefore, it's an infinite relationship. Let's see, the thinking power of the I is therefore infinite because when it thinks, it is in relation to an object which is itself. There you go, the I is the pure, immediate, intuitive abstraction of thought or reason itself. The I is not like a soul or something that most people think like as a substance. The I is the very process of the self-production of its cognition of its cognition. It is the immediate thought of its own thinking. And I think that's the only thing for that paragraph. The thinking of the old metaphysical system was finite. Its whole mode of action was regulated by categories, the limits of which it believed to be permanently fixed and not subject to any further negation. Thus, one of its questions was, has God existence? The question supposes that existence is an altogether positive term, a term of ne plus ultra. We shall see, however, at a later point that existence is by no means a merely positive term, but one which is too low for the absolute idea and unworthy of God. So, famously, Kant says existence is not a predicate. Hegel actually agrees, not for the same reasons that Kant agrees. Kant says it's not a predicate because it doesn't add any meaning. Hegel says it does actually add meanings. The thing is, it's also not a predicate. Because in stating a thing, it already exists. To state God is already to have stepped into the domain of existence. And it's not that existence can append to it. Existence is already integrated into it, necessarily. It's integrated into anything which you will state. The only thing, and the only reason we seem to think that this is some kind of meaningful difference is because we compare representations to natural objects. And of course, in taking natural objectivity to be the domain of existence and not taking thought itself to exist, you state a thought and you say, well, this is only a possibility, it's a logical possibility, but, it doesn't actually exist. And by which you mean it doesn't actually pertain to the domain of nature. It's not physical, it's not spatial-temporal, it's not out there. But that's not what existence is for Hegel. There's two senses of existence. There's a really low sense, which is the main one he comments on as far as I know, and there's a higher sense in the logic of essence, which in German, like the first one is Dasein, the second one is existence. But in English, we just do not have two terms that actually make this distinction. So it's just now translated as, well, it used to be translated as just determinate being and then existence. And now it's just translated as existence for the first one and then concrete existence for the second one. So let's see. So a second question in these metaphysical systems was, is the world finite or infinite? The very terms of the question assume that the finite is a permanent and contradictory to the infinite. A permanent contradictory to the infinite. And one can easily see that when they are so opposed, the infinite, which of course ought to be the whole, only appears as a single aspect and suffers restriction from the finite. But a restricted infinity is itself only a finite. In the same way it was asked whether the soul was simple or composite. Simpleness was, in other words, taken to be an ultimate characteristic, giving expression to a whole truth. Far from being so, simpleness is the expression of a half-truth, as one-sided and abstract as existence, a term of thought which, as we shall hereafter see, is itself untrue and hence unable to hold truth. If the soul be viewed as merely and abstractly simple, it is characterized as in an inadequate and finite way. Yeah, but simplicity is another name for immediacy. There can be no such thing as abstract immediacy. It's impossible. Immediacy itself states and performs a contradiction against that, so that the utmost simplicity is also the utmost complexity. Simplicity and complexity, immediacy and mediation aren't really opposites in a proper sense. They're not incompatible. It was therefore the main question of the pre-Kantian metaphysics to discover whether predicates of the kind mentioned were to be ascribed to its objects. Now these predicates are, after all, limited formulae of the understanding which, instead of expressing the truth, merely impose a limit. More than this, it should be noted that the chief feature of the method lay in assigning or attributing predicates to the object that was to be cognized, for example, to God. But attribution is no more than an external reflection about the object. The predicates by which the object is to be determined are supplied from the resources of picture thought, and are applied in a mechanical way. Whereas, if we are to have genuine cognition, the object must characterize its own self and not derive its predicates from without. Even supposing we follow the method of predicating, the mind cannot help feeling that predicates of this sort fail to exhaust the object. From the same point of view, the Orientals are quite correct in calling God the many-named or the myriad-named one. One after another of these finite categories leaves the soul unsatisfied, and the Oriental sage is compelled unceasingly to seek for more and more of such predicates. In finite things, it is no doubt the case that they have to be characterized through finite predicates, and with these things the understanding finds proper scope for its special action. Itself finite, it knows only the nature of the finite. Thus, when I call some action a theft, I have characterized the action in its essential facts, and such a knowledge is sufficient for the judge. Similarly, finite things stand to each other as cause and effect, force and exercise, and when they are apprehended in these categories, they are known in their finitude. But the objects of reason cannot be defined by these finite predicates. To try to do so was the defect of the old metaphysic. So 29. Predicates of this kind, taken individually, have but a limited range of meaning, and no one can fail to perceive how inadequate they are, and how far they fall below the fullness of detail which our imaginative thought gives, in the case, for example, of God, mind, or nature. Besides, though the fact of their being all predicates of one subject supplies them with a certain connection, their several meanings keep them apart, and consequently each is brought in as a stranger in relation to the others. The first of these defects the Orientals sought to remedy, when, for example, they defined God by attributing to him many names. but still they felt that the number of names would have had to be infinite. So, I mean, this is just further elaboration stuff that was going on in the second section, somewhere around section like 24. Well, somewhere around like section 20, actually. Which is stipulated definitions just do not work for philosophy. We're the ones stipulating that, this is attributed to that. And we're just taking these things as given. We take the object to be predicated upon to be given, and we take the object which is being predicated to given, or being predicated to another as given. But we don't inquire into whether these are actually like legitimate objects and what these objects themselves are. And then the connection that they have is merely one in which perhaps we're observing something, perhaps we're looking at something, and we can see that they're there together, but that's only a thing projected or reflected, projection is more proper in this case, by us onto the thing. We don't actually know that these things really belong together, which is why you get a lot of weird confusions like nominalism and such, in which people don't believe that unities really exist. People don't believe that differences really exist, and they say, yes, it seems that way, but it only seems that way to me, and it is only a seeming. The thing really is only like a disjointed many. There is, in fact, no apple. There is, in fact, just atoms, or, you can go the other way, which is there are no atoms. There is, in fact, not even an apple. There's just the one. All these the differences are nothing but illusions, and whatnot. And these are just ways in which I'm trying to predicate on things. I'm trying to think about things. I project upon things, and I think about them as things. Section 30. 2. In the second place, the metaphysical systems adopted a wrong criterion. Their objects were no doubt totalities which in their own proper selves belong to reason, that is, to the organized and systematically developed universe of thought. But these totalities, God, the soul, and the world, were taken by the metaphysician as subjects made and ready to form the basis for an application of the categories of the understanding. They were assumed from popular conception. Accordingly, popular conception was the only canon for settling whether or not predicates were suitable and sufficient. Popular conception was the only canon, meaning people thought things were objective insofar as we could agree to them, but then somebody came in and said, like, no, I don't think that's what that is. Here's my new definition, and nothing could be settled. Because, if we have a problem with, like, defining a car, at least more than less than anything, more than less. Something like a car, if we have a dispute, what is the car? We can just look at the car. If somebody's like using the word car and actually they're defining a banana, you can easily tell. Well, with object of reason, the object is not there except for the construction of reason itself. So you can't really have any disputes of this kind in this way about God or the soul or the world or beauty or causation or anything like that. These are not given objects. They are pure objects of reason. So, popular conception cannot be a valid measure ever, not just for this stuff, but for anything. And actually, a comment on the prior paragraph, in which, or actually, a couple prior paragraphs, I forget which one it is. He mentioned that, the understanding actually has its place, which is, for finite things. So, what is Hegel's philosophy for? Not for your everyday things. I've mentioned this quite a bit in many things that I record or write, which is you're not gonna do anything dialectical or think anything dialectical in your everyday life. You cook with the understanding. You do your job with the understanding. This method of philosophy that is Hegel's is only for infinite objects of reason. They are not for anything else. They then contextualize all the other finite things, but the finite things are related and exist in finite ways. So therefore, the usual ways of just referring to things in abstraction, pitting things against each other, distinguishing things in a given way, especially when having objects that aren't real objects, they're just conventional, they are just up to agreement. All those things are perfectly fine and dandy in everyday life with the understanding. The understanding is just not sufficient for philosophy. That is the only issue that it has. Let's see. Well, we are at 55 minutes, and I only want this to go about an hour, so I think we'll just leave it here. We'll stop at section 31, and we'll pick it up next time. So for those of you listening, keep on listening. See you around.